In 1856, the Crimean War ended with the defeat of Russia's ambitions against the Ottoman Empire. But though the Eastern question, the problem of what to do with the still declining Turkish state, was put on ice in 1856, it had not been permanently solved. The Crimean War had been primarily caused by the designs of the great powers. In 1875, none of them seriously wanted to reopen the wound and the arguments that would come with it. The Russians still felt humiliated by the closure of the Turkish straits to their navy, yet since they had no Black Sea fleet, they would be in a worse position if the straits were opened. The Austrians still depended upon free navigation of the Danube as their main economic link with the rest of the world, something that could easily change if the pliable Turks were not their neighbours. The British still needed the Ottoman Empire as a great neutral buffer to secure the Eastern Mediterranean. If not completely satisfied, none of these empires were aggravated enough to reopen the issue. This time, however, the crisis would in effect be forced upon them. The Ottoman Empire in 1875 was a failing and increasingly tyrannical despotism. Some of the worst deprivation was to be found in its Balkan provinces, largely populated by Christians hostile to Turkish rule. In July, a revolt broke out in Herzegovina, followed quickly by another in Bosnia. These rebellions presented both Austria-Hungary and Russia each with a problem. If Turkish rule collapsed, it would be replaced by new nation-states, an idea that haunted Habsburg statesmen trying to hold together a multi-ethnic empire. The foreign minister, Andrassy, was particularly aware of the problems a disintegration of Ottoman power could cause. In January 1875, before the revolts had broken out, he stated, "Turkey possesses a utility almost providential for Austria-Hungary, for Turkey maintains the status quo of the small Balkan states and impedes their nationalistic aspirations." For Russia, the problem was quite the opposite. Slav revolts were encouraged by an increasingly prevalent idea in the country known as Pan-Slavism. This eclectic mix of Western nationalism and Orthodox mysticism varied in practice from vague Slav sympathy to grandiose plans for a united Slav empire. It was the sentiment, not the programme, that was the important thing about it. Though despots, the Russian Tsars were always sensitive to the limited public opinion in their empire, and Alexander II was in no position to stand against Pan-Slav sentiments. The international situation was further complicated by political divides in both empires. In Austria-Hungary, the military only wished to absorb new territory, and would have been quite happy to carve up the Balkans with St. Petersburg. In Russia, the decision-making elite such as the foreign minister Gorchakov and ambassador in London Shuvalov disagreed with Pan-Slavism's often wild ambitions. These divides meant neither power held to a consistent diplomatic line throughout the crisis. With the revolts underway, Andrassy moved first, aiming to put the Eastern question back on ice. He proposed that Austria, Russia and Germany, allies by way of the Three Emperors League, should instruct their consuls to settle the revolt on the spot, preventing any talk of independent states, but the scheme was destroyed by the French foreign minister Decazes' protests to St. Petersburg. Decazes wanted to reassert France as a great power, and saw here an opportunity to do so. Russia, hoping to play France off against Germany, couldn't afford to alienate her, and so an invitation to join the consular mission was extended to Paris. But doing so also meant having to extend one to Italy and Great Britain. The British were tempted to reject the invitation, but the Turks requested they accept, and so also joined, albeit with the sole aim of defending Turkish interests. As it was, the consular mission failed, and its attempts at mediation were rejected by the Porte. Next was a suggestion from the Russian ambassador at Constantinople, Ignatiev. He was a believer in Pan-Slavism and proposed a European mediation led by himself that would force the Turks to offer autonomy to their Balkan peoples, a preliminary for independent states. But though Alexander and Gorchakov both expected this to eventually happen, they didn't want to yet take the initiative and alienate Austria-Hungary, something setting up nation-states in the Balkans would certainly do. Russian strategic thinking at this point was dominated by a fear of being isolated from the other great powers, as they had been at the time of the Crimean War. Austria thus had to be appeased until the opportune moment, and so the initiative once again passed to Andrassy. The result was the Andrassy Note of the 30th of December 1875, a programme of reforms the powers were to recommend to Turkey. The pattern repeated itself. Andrassy wished to limit the action to the three emperors, the Tsar insisted on bringing in France, and the British came in to see that Turkey came to no harm, but nor did she come to good. Though the Turks accepted the Andrassy note when it was put to them at the end of January, they did not apply its proposals, and the Balkan rebels ignored the talk of reforms, which were in any case inadequate. With Austria's approaches a failure, Gorchakov now thought the time right to suggest his own solution. His hope was that Vienna would at this point be amenable to a Russian programme. If not, he expected the Germans would force them to comply, based on an erroneous belief the Russians were still owed a debt for their benevolent neutrality during Bismarck's Wars of Unification. He was wrong on both counts. When Andrassy, Gorchakov and Bismarck met in Berlin on the 11th of May 1876, Gorchakov argued for an intervention by the Great Powers to impose reforms on Turkey, though he assumed that autonomous states would be the result. But contrary to his expectations, Bismarck would not strong-arm Austria and would only support what had been agreed between his two allies. Gorchakov backed down. Back to square one, Andrassy once more drafted a new project of reforms, and Gorchakov added only a stipulation that, if these failed, there would have to be the sanction of an understanding with a view to effective measures. Diplomats are not prone to simplicity. This memorandum was yet again passed on to France, Italy and Britain. This time, the pattern changed decisively. Whilst France and Italy accepted Andrassy's Berlin memorandum, as they had done before, the British turned it down point blank, ensuring its failure. The Prime Minister, Disraeli, was furious that Britain was being treated as if it were, in his words, Montenegro or Bosnia, and being dictated to. He wrongly, as it turned out, suspected the three emperors were conspiring to destroy the Ottoman Empire. In response, he ordered the British fleet to anchor just outside the Dardanelles. He then suggested to the Russian ambassador, Shavalov, that London and St. Petersburg settle the matter themselves, without Vienna. But Disraeli's demands, which amounted to Russia dropping its support for the Balkan Slavs and letting the Turks crush the rebellions, were never going to have been acceptable. His real aim here was probably more subtle. By rejecting the Berlin Memorandum and negotiating separately with St. Petersburg, Disraeli likely hoped to drive a wedge between Austria and Russia. Gorchakov flailed around looking for other allies to avoid being isolated by Disraeli, but the French refused a proposal to send their fleet to the Dardanelles as well, killing any hope of an alliance in that direction. With Britain's price too high and France uncooperative, Russia was forced once again to look to Austria to avoid isolation, meaning she was still unlikely to gain any alteration to the status of the Balkan nationalities. Gorchakov met Andrassy again on the 8th of July 1876, but by this time the Turkish internal situation was deteriorating rapidly. The revolt had spread to Bulgaria, the Ottoman Sultan abdicated at the end of May, and in June Serbia and Montenegro declared war on the Turks. No longer was it a question of dealing with a minor revolt. The complete dissolution of the Ottoman Empire now seemed at hand. So, rather than attempt to draft yet more reforms that were unlikely to be implemented, Austria and Russia instead agreed to the principle of non-intervention, or so it was thought. If the Turks won the war and crushed the rebellions, they would not be allowed to benefit from their victory in any real way, and if she lost, Austria and Russia would divide the empire between them. It was a reasonable agreement, and there was little the British could have done about it. Yet just months later it was upended by Alexander II. In the autumn of 1876 he declared Russia could no longer bear the oppression of the Balkan Slavs. There were a number of reasons for the Tsar's decision to finally move against Turkey. On a practical level, the Ottomans had defeated Serbia and Montenegro and had to have their victory checked. International opinion was favourable. Turkish atrocities meant the British public would not allow Disraeli to support them, and there was a sensitivity to the public mood in Russia, highlighted by a rare speech given on the 11th of November by Alexander, which concluded with the words, "May God help us to fulfill our sacred mission." Gorchakov's new task was to secure the way for Russian military intervention in the Ottoman Empire. This meant squaring all of the great powers, for if they combined against Russian intervention, she would be forced to back down. He started with Germany, which Gorchakov still believed owed Russia and could keep Austria submissive. When Bismarck had fought his wars of unification, Russia had maintained a benevolent neutrality. Now, they expected the Iron Chancellor to repay the debt by supporting Russia's own war. But Bismarck was unmoved. He believed he had paid the debt by supporting Russia's remilitarization of the Black Sea in 1870. He would thus not bow to Gorchakov's demands. Bismarck's gripe was not that Russia was going to war. He would have been happy to see the Ottoman Empire dismantled. Rather, it was that he wanted Russia and Austria to work together in doing so, and would not jeopardise his alliance with the Habsburgs by forcing them to comply, as Gorchakov wanted. It meant Russia would have to strike a separate bargain with Austria-Hungary. The negotiations were tense. Andressy was a wily politician who obscured the fact Austria was in no position to fight Russia over its Balkan interests. Indeed, Austrian generals would rather have been fighting alongside them. But the Russians were desperate to conclude the pact quickly, and so the Budapest Conventions, as the agreements became known, secured for Austria-Hungary a neutral buffer between them and Russia in the form of Serbia and Montenegro, all of Bosnia-Herzegovina for the Habsburg Empire, and a term that was to become important later, which vaguely specified there was to be no great compact Slav state or other. Even so, Russia had now protected herself from the isolation she experienced in the Crimean War. There was even more good news internationally for the Tsar. In November 1876, the British proposed a conference at Constantinople to work out yet another set of reforms. Though all of the great powers sent representatives, negotiations were mainly between the British plenipotentiary, Lord Salisbury, and his Russian counterpart, Ignatieff. As was to become standard over the following decades, Salisbury showed himself to be the most reasonable and far-seeing British statesman of the day. He rejected Disraeli's line that Turkey had to be supported no matter what, and instead sought a compromise with Ignatieff. But the Turks again rejected any serious reform proposals. They calculated that the British would still support them anyway, fearing Russia too much. They were wrong. Not even Disraeli could object to the Russians going to war for the sake of reforms his government had helped draft, whilst anti-Turk sentiment in Britain now tied his hands. Gorchakov and Alexander had aligned every country they needed. They were now free to crush the Ottoman Empire without interference, provided they do it quickly. On the 24th of April, Russia declared war on Turkey. In Britain, the government was paralysed. London had always been the traditional protector of the Ottoman Empire, using it as a buffer state against Russian expansionism, which might threaten British connections to India via the Mediterranean. But this realpolitik had been turned on its head by atrocities committed by Turkish troops whilst putting down the Balkan rebellions. Some of the worst perpetrators were the Bashi Bazouks, irregular soldiers infamous for their looting. The Disraeli ministry had initially tried to ignore such reports, but in 1876 William Gladstone, former Liberal Prime Minister and the greatest statesman of the day, emerged from retirement to denounce the government's inaction. His pamphlet, The Bulgarian Horrors, savaged Disraeli's pro-Turkish policy and rallied public opinion. At the same time, Britain had in office probably the most inactive foreign secretary in its history, the Earl of Derby. He seemed utterly incapable of formulating a coherent, or for that matter incoherent, response. When Russia finally declared war, British public opinion was still rabidly hostile to Turkey. Had early Russian successes continued and the Ottoman Empire had been defeated in the summer of 1877, as seemed likely, Russia could have imposed any peace it wanted, and Disraeli would have been able to do nothing. But in July, Russian armies came upon the hitherto unknown fort of Plevna, blocking the road to Constantinople. With great bravery, the Turks withstood a siege until early December. It was enough. In Britain, the Ottoman Empire was transformed in the public mind from brutal oppressor to a valiant resistor of aggression. Old Russophobic fears quickly overtook the national mood. What's more, though the Russian forces hauled themselves to the gates of Constantinople in January 1878, they were in reality little better off than the collapsing Turkish army at that point. An armistice was soon after concluded, but Russia was in no position to renew the conflict should she need to. Salisbury astutely observed, their military history has been one long record of defeat, their finances, never good, are now desperate, their social condition is a prolonged crisis threatening at any moment of weakness socialist revolution. Russian weakness was to play a crucial role in the negotiations that year. They had expected the Ottoman Empire to crumble, and for peace terms to have become obvious from there. The fact Turkey had survived meant St. Petersburg had to hastily create a treaty that both cemented their victory and did something to relieve the plight of Balkan Christians. The result was San Stefano, mainly negotiated by the Pan-Slav Ignatieff. This created what was to become known as Big Bulgaria, which Russia would occupy for 2 years and then maintain as a puppet indefinitely, along with the independence of Serbia, Montenegro and Romania. The Turks put up little resistance in the negotiations and preferred to make their capitulation someone else's problem. If Russia was to be checked, it would fall to the British Empire to do it. But Britain continued to be paralysed by the vacillating leadership of Derby in foreign affairs. On the 23rd of January 1878, before the armistice, the British fleet had been ordered to Constantinople. Derby, scared of any action at all, had resigned. The order was withdrawn and Derby persuaded to remain in office. Finally, in February, the fleet was once again ordered through the Dardanelles and arrived at Constantinople on the 13th. Derby clung on at the Foreign Office until the end of March, hoping to deter any action that could lead to war, but when the cabinet overruled him and called up the reserves, he finally resigned. He was replaced by Salisbury. At last, Britain could begin to set the agenda, and on the 29th of March, he published the Salisbury Circular, outlining Britain's objections to the Treaty of San Stefano. Austria's objections were even more forceful. Ignatieff had elected to ignore the Budapest Conventions when negotiating San Stefano, meaning he had made no allowance for an Austrian occupation of Bosnia, whilst Big Bulgaria certainly violated the promise of no Great Compact state, at least in Andrussy's mind. Ignatieff tried to rectify his mistake, but Andrussy refused his suggestions, whilst Bismarck yet again declined to strong-arm Austria. Germany's lack of action was a particularly crushing blow, as it effectively isolated Russia internationally after all. For the first time, but certainly not the last, the Russo-Prussian friendship was shaken. The views of Britain and Austria greatly alarmed Gorchakov, who knew his country was in no condition to stand against both. Shavalov was ordered to belatedly come to an accommodation with the British. Salisbury exploited the fact that Russia was in no state to continue the war to press home his claims. He insisted that Bulgaria was divided by a line running from east to west along the Balkan mountains, something that would show the Russians did not dominate the Balkans. By negotiating directly with Russia, Salisbury also avoided having to buy Austria's support for a formal alliance. Andrussy panicked and appealed to Bismarck. Salisbury, genuinely grateful for Bismarck's even-handed approach throughout the crisis, signed a separate agreement out of respect for the German Chancellor that allowed Austria to occupy Bosnia in return for recognising his new treaty with Russia. Salisbury's final move was to secure a treaty with the Turks on the 4th of June, which guaranteed their possessions in Asia Minor in return for Cyprus, which gave Britain a naval outlet in the eastern Mediterranean. The Congress of Berlin, which convened on the 13th of June to finalise the settlement, was to a large extent an anticlimax, for most of the important details had been agreed beforehand. Nonetheless, Russian diplomats several times threatened to reopen the crisis by trying to squirm out of the concessions they'd made. At one point, Disraeli, leading the British delegation, ordered a special train to be prepared to take him back to London for war preparations. The thought of restarting the conflict quickly brought the Russians back to their senses. In the end, Big Bulgaria was split 3 ways: an autonomous principality, a semi-autonomous province in eastern Rumelia, and Macedonia, which remained an integral part of the Ottoman Empire. Austria was to occupy Bosnia and garrison the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, the strip of Turkish territory which separated Serbia from Montenegro. The Russians recovered the Bessarabian territory lost in 1856, and more importantly Batum at the eastern end of the Black Sea. Theoretically, the Berlin settlement did give Russia more territory than she had wanted when the war had first been declared in 1877. But Russia had gone to war more for Pan-Slav sentiment and to restore national pride than for any practical reason, yet her prestige had been severely damaged by the check at Berlin. For Britain it was a qualified triumph. Russian expansionism had been contained and Turkey restored, but there were still problems. Though the Ottoman Empire had survived, Salisbury was under no illusions as to what her position was. "We shall set up a rickety sort of Turkish rule again south of the Balkans," he minuted to the cabinet. But it is a mere respite, there is no vitality left in them. It showed there was a pressing need for Britain to rethink its onerous commitment to the Ottomans, but this would have to wait until Salisbury's ascendancy nearly a decade later. The problems the Berlin settlement clearly left meant none of the statesmen at the Congress would have expected it to last long. In the end, it survived relatively intact for 34 years. Europe was at peace.